Welcome to RuralStrong, where we talk real challenges and bold solutions in rural economic development. I'm your host, Joe Barker. Let's get into it. Welcome to RuralStrong, and we are broadcasting today from the Southwest Tennessee Development District podcast studio in Jackson, Tennessee, and our special guest today is Dr. Chris Kuehl, who is the Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence, and Chris provides forecast and strategic guidance for a wide variety of corporate clients and business organizations around the world. He is the economic analyst for several national and international organizations. And prior to starting Armada in 1999, he was a professor of economics and finance for 15 years, teaching in the U.S., Hungary, Russia, Estonia, Singapore, and Taiwan. He holds advanced degrees in economics, Soviet studies, and East Asian studies. And on top of that, he is the co-author of the Flagship and The Watch, both publications from Armada. Chris, welcome to RuralStrong.
Well, thank you. And after an introduction like that, I hope the audience is still awake. It's like, how thrilling, an economist. So get a cup of coffee and settle in, and we'll talk about what's happening in the wild world. And yes, I do know that corporate intelligence is an oxymoron.
Well, I've had the opportunity to hear you on numerous occasions. You've actually been to Jackson before and spoke to a group that we put together. And I was just really excited when you agreed to come on the podcast, because I don't know of anyone I'd rather speak to about what's happening in our economy and the world today. So let's just start by, why don't you give us a little overview of what you view as the current state of the rural economy in the U.S.?
Yeah, the rural economy is always kind of taking it in the chin. I mean, it doesn't get as much attention really as it should. I mean, I live in Kansas, so I'm in a very agricultural state, and it has got the reputation of being the flyover state. And then I always look at people saying, yeah, well, unless you want to eat something, in which case you better quit flying over. The rural economy ends up being kind of caught between the decisions that are being made that orient towards the urban areas and what's going on in sort of the macro economy. You can see that a lot with the tariff discussion now, because as people think about what's being accomplished with the tariffs, sometimes it's to the good of the rural communities, sometimes it's to the bad. For example, with, again, Kansas, the average Kansan is well aware of the fact that China is a command economy and one that is constantly kind of playing fast and loose with trade rules. But it's also one of the largest markets for what Kansas produces. And so whenever a decision is made regarding what to do and not do with China, the Kansas farmer is like, okay, I get it, but they're the ones that buy our wheat and our soybeans, and don't screw this up. So it's always a little bit of a challenge. The agricultural community has also had to react to the problems that affect everybody else in the economy: worker shortage, the advance of technology, how to react to consumer demand. I mean, all of these things, with oftentimes not the access to resources that would be ideal. So not that it's impossible, but as you guys are well aware, it can be a struggle on a daily basis.
Well, and you mentioned the state of the world, and of course tariffs. Every time you turn on the news, there's a discussion about the effect of tariffs on different sectors of the economy. Talk a little bit about tariffs and the agricultural economy and how you view that.
Yeah, the tariff idea is not unique. I mean, tariff is an old tactic designed to emphasize domestic production over imports. And it's not necessarily the most effective way to do that. What's much more effective, I mean, 73% of what we do to control access to our market are non-tariff barriers. Things like quotas, things like certain products we will not let into the country because we've deemed them unsafe or dangerous or that they've been produced under questionable circumstances. There's lots of rationales. But the idea behind a tariff is to make a product that comes in from outside the US more expensive. So the consumer in the US then has a choice. It's like if I buy the imported product, it costs more. If I buy the domestic product, theoretically, it costs less. And that ends up driving more business back to the US, ideally. Frequently, it doesn't quite work out that way because we don't produce the product that has the tariff imposed, so there is no alternative domestically. Or you get a domestic producer that simply raises their price to match whatever the price is that the importer is paying. So it's a not necessarily a guaranteed approach to solving the problem. From the agricultural perspective, most of what we sell around the world is agricultural. You know, we're a major export country, but we don't produce a lot of the consumer goods that other countries produce. So we buy most of those from outside the US. What we produce on a manufacturing level is usually very high level and road building equipment and railroad engines. But the bulk of what we export is agricultural. So when you are imposing tariffs on other countries, they will frequently with their own tariffs on us, and that often gets aimed at agricultural product because that's mostly what we sell. So the farmer is like, okay, I'm glad that we're doing something to rebuild steel production in the US or manufacturing in the US. However, the countries that we're attacking with these tariffs are now coming back and saying, well, we're not going to import wheat or corn or agricultural output without assessing a tariff. And the farmer says, well, we're getting hurt by that decision, and we're not really benefiting too much from the tariff protections that are being imposed. So it's again, they kind of get caught in the middle. And it's the US produces 24% of the world's corn, 25% of the world's soybeans, like 26% of the world's wheat. We try to eat it all, but we have to sell the majority of it. So,
Well, and we have the discussion about tariffs, and then you've mentioned the pressures on finding labor in the agricultural community, and then we have this continued innovation. With all those pressures, what do you see for the future of agriculture, at least on the near term for the U.S.?
well, it continues to consolidate. I mean, we've been watching for the last several years that the agricultural operations have become larger, more kind of corporate driven. It's harder for the small farm to compete. And there's a lot of emphasis on what kind of shifts and changes are taking place in the consumer sector. What do consumers want? What are they willing to pay for? What kind of adjustments are being demanded on the part of the rural community? And as you point out, I mean, the labor force issue goes hand in glove with the issue of rural communities losing population in general. I mean, that's been an issue for decades. The young population migrates to the larger communities and leaves the smaller communities at a real deficit. And so then the local agricultural community is like, we don't have a lot of people to recruit from. And that ends up kind of rippling through an entire community. I mean, I know just in the states around Kansas City, there's just been lots and lots of efforts to try to rebuild the communities so that the population grows enough that you've got potential not only for agricultural hiring, but for the manufacturers that end up locating in more rural areas. I mean, people forget, if they ever knew, that 70% of the manufacturing in the United States takes place in rural communities. So manufacturing is not in cities. And it's pretty obvious when you drive around a city, it's like, well, cities don't want big manufacturing stuff right in the middle of their city. So it gets pushed out to more rural areas. Most manufacturers, 90% of them, have 100 employees or less. And they're frequently in rural areas. So people think of rural areas as all farming, but it's like, no, about half of it's manufacturing, half of it's traditional farming.
Well, I know in Tennessee there's been a huge emphasis on recruiting manufacturing to rural areas, and the state has been highly successful in that. And when you look at education and training programs, how do they influence economic opportunities in rural regions?
Well, they're huge because that's ultimately the solution to the labor shortage is not only do you have to have people, you have to have people willing to take those jobs and get trained for those jobs. Manufacturing, agriculture, every sector now has become much more sophisticated. And in order for people to go to work successfully, they have to understand the technology. They have to, I mean, in the old days, you could hire a welder as long as they could put down a good bead. Now they better know how to program a robot welding arm and put down a good bead. So they've got to have a level of sophistication that is much higher than it used to be. And companies that have 50 to 100 people, they don't have a lot of latitude to do their own training. They need to have people that are basically ready to go the day they're hired. So a lot of emphasis on trade schools, a lot of emphasis on community colleges, and rural communities are taking note of this and trying to put more emphasis on those schools and getting into the high schools and saying, look, and not every kid is going to go work in a cloth covered cube somewhere. They need to be educated for the jobs that are out there because they're good paying jobs, they're sophisticated jobs, they're career type jobs. It's like I was reading the other day, the fastest route to a $100,000 a year career in the state of Kansas is to become a lineman. $100,000 a year plus a signing bonus. So there's a lot of opportunity, but it has to be managed.
And in your opinion, is the country doing enough to train for those types of jobs that are in so much demand?
Not by a long shot. We are way behind many other countries in doing that kind of training. We still sort of have the notion that everyone should be kind of marching out with some kind of a general college degree. I was a professor for 15 years, and I used to be very unpopular with my fellow faculty because I kept looking at them going, why are you teaching worthless stuff? I mean, nobody needs this. But meanwhile, you're not training people for the jobs that are really out there. Not that we want to completely copy, for example, the Germans who end up directing you into your career when you're still like in junior high. But on the other hand, they don't have worker shortage. They basically train for the jobs that are out there. And if you want to do something else, you're welcome to it. But if you want a job, and frankly, that's why most kids go to school. They're basically looking to start a career. And we don't support trade schools as much as we should. We don't support, I mean, only 5 to 6% of high schools now still have industrial arts because it's expensive. And a lot of those schools can't keep up with it anymore. So they stop doing it. Well, that leaves a huge deficit of kids that don't even know what the opportunities are. They've had no exposure to it.
Well, and in rural economies or rural areas, Chris, we still see population decline and
Mm.
aging population. Uh, what strategies can the rural folks implement to combat these trends?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a matter of trying to take advantage of what it is that would appeal in the rural communities. I mean, you've seen a bit of a shift generationally. You know, the Gen Z person in their 20s, early 30s, they're looking at the world a little differently than the generations before them. You know, a lot of the data coming out is that they're considerably less interested in kind of the traditional career paths that were forged by millennials and Gen X, certainly boomers, and are more attracted to kind of a family atmosphere, more attracted to being able to do things that it's kind of this notion of you either work to live or you live to work. The boomers were the live to work generation. You know, we defined ourselves by what we did and we're willing to make any sacrifice necessary for the career. Gen Z is just the opposite. They're basically saying, no, I work to live. I want a job that allows me to live the lifestyle I want to live. And if that lifestyle is more family oriented, more personally oriented, then I don't want a job that requires, 80 hours a week of commitment. And so the rural community has become more appealing if the rural community can make that case. And so you see it a lot in certain parts of the country where a community just suddenly flourishes because they've started to really attract people back to the community and back to a particular lifestyle. It's actually been referred to as the HGTV effect. So pe- people will look at things like, wow, how did Laurel, Mississippi suddenly become the fastest growing community in Mississippi? Well, Ben and Aaron, everybody is like, ooh, I want to live there. And that kind of drive, you see communities copying it. I mean, I've seen it locally, I've seen it around the country. It's like, gee, what did you do to attract all these people? So,
Well, and then you've got the infrastructure
mhm,
challenge, things such as transportation,
mhm.
broadband. This all plays a huge part in that rural economy.
Yeah, very definitely. I mean, at one time, the most critical thing for any community was highway access, rail access. Now it's broadband because people can do what they do from anywhere. We saw that really explode during the pandemic, and people fled the big city just trying to avoid the COVID mess and decided that, hey, I can work remotely, I can work from wherever I want to in the country, and it doesn't matter. A little bit of that has faded. Companies have been asking people to come back to work in the traditional way, but there are lots and lots of sectors of the economy that are like, no, we don't need people to physically be here. We can do what we do remotely. And it's particularly professions like accounting and banking and finance and things that are, basically done in isolation anyway. I mean, the average accountant is plastered in front of their computer 24/7. So it doesn't matter if they're doing it in a city or a small town.
You mentioned Laurel, Mississippi, and that is an interesting story, and maybe elaborate on Laurel a little bit, Chris, on how they reinvented themselves.
Yeah, I mean that's an example of having kind of a commitment to a new identity. I mean, they were starting down that path even before, Ben and Aaron took on the TV show. But once that became a national thing, you had all of this migration into the area because it became known as kind of an artist colony, that if you were going to start up something, this would be the place. And you have, the Scotsman company became the anchor for production. When you think about what that company makes and how they've kind of translated that into a TV show, the vast majority of what that company makes are cutting boards and wooden kitchen tools. It's not exactly high level stuff, but it's well made, and it has that artisan's approach. And then all of the stuff that came on top of it, rehabbing the city, rehabbing houses, and you see it over and over again. You see it in Bentonville with Dave and Jenny Mars. I mean, so it's not necessarily universal, but I've seen a lot of local examples. And just I keep referring back to Kansas, but it's my state. You've got a community out in the middle of the state, Wabigo, that has grown like crazy because it's established itself as the headquarters of the Wizard of Oz. So people who like that movie, I mean, they have Oz Winery, for crying out loud. So pretty decent wine from the middle of Kansas. Who would have thought? And that's the kind of progressive, let's do something to make us attractive and take advantage of the fact that Gen Z, even the millennial that can work remotely, can do it from here. I mean, that's one of the things when you watch these shows, these people that have moved in, what do? Well, they're in a profession that allows them to live anywhere. And their headquarters may be San Francisco, but they live in Mississippi.
Chris, I'm a huge proponent of asset-based strategic planning, and as we look at rural communities, and you've just given several examples, this is something that every rural community can do. Each community has unique assets, and if you capitalize on those assets, your chances for success go up proportionately. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, even to the point of kind of identifying what kind of migrant you want to attract, and looking for what it is that makes your community unique. It could be that it's an area that would appeal to artisans. It could be an area that appeals to a manufacturer that is wanting to be in a unique area. The assets vary tremendously. I mean, you get communities like Great Bend, Kansas, which has become a manufacturing hub because they decided to really structure the community to service those new migrants. You're seeing a lot of orientation towards energy. You're seeing a lot of orientation towards technology. And it seems like an overwhelming challenge, but when you start breaking it down, it's like, well, what do you need to attract a tech company? What is it that is going to appeal to that operation to locate where you are? And often it's a little bit surprising. I was in a community in South Carolina that attracted Pratt and Whitney to build aircraft engines because the local community college agreed to put together a very sophisticated program to train aircraft mechanics. And Pratt and Whitney said, fine, because the number one thing we need is people. So if you will train them, we'll move there. And they did.
And and most of the time, we look to the federal government, we look to the state government, but it's these local decisions that are made that really and truly at the end of the day make the difference. So, what role do local governments and policymakers play in fostering a thriving rural economy?
Yeah, I think it's important for them to kind of be the cheerleaders. I mean, there's a lot of resources that will be available from the feds, from the state, private, but you've got to have somebody that is kind of agreeing to coordinate all this and make the ask. And that's going to be the local person who's not only going to be looking for those opportunities, but rallying the community and saying, look, in order for us to be appealing to these groups we're trying to recruit, we need to be welcoming. We need to be in a position to provide what it is they're interested in. And sometimes it can be something grand like, infrastructure development, or it can be something very subtle. One of the discussions and close to where you guys are, Chattanooga, when Volkswagen was deciding where to go in the country. One of the reasons they chose Chattanooga was that the local officials agreed to encourage German restaurants and German service providers. And they said, look, we're going to have a lot of people coming here from Germany. They want German food.
Absolutely.
So can you do something? And now Chattanooga, by God, has some of the best beer in the state of Tennessee. So
sounds like you've made a tour.
I have. I've been to Nuga, and it's like, yep, this is German food. So.
Let me ask you this: we have a lot of entrepreneurs in rural areas, and for an entrepreneur looking to start a business in a rural area, what advice could you give them?
I think the number one thing is paying attention to where there is a need. I mean, that's always been the mantra of the entrepreneur: find a need and meet it. And the rural communities have lots of needs, and so it's breaking down what it is that people most want to see. And right now, the number one driver for a lot of people in rural communities is, are you taking care of my children? Is there something for them to do? Is there some reason for them to stay here? So it becomes incumbent on the leadership to say, what is it that young people want? What's interesting about Gen Z right now is that they grew up during the pandemic era. And so they were very isolated, didn't have an opportunity to interact. So now they are the most interaction oriented of the generations. They don't like online shopping. They want to physically go someplace so they can actually see human beings. So the more that a rural community can say, look, we're trying to really orient towards the young and understand what it is they want, what kind of interactions they want, what's going to convince them to stay here and raise their children. Because Gen Z is turning out to be the one that is thinking more about their kids. The millennials kind of like, yeah, whatever. We want to take care of ourselves. The Gen Z is kind of responding against that, saying, nope, I want kids and I want a world that's oriented towards my kids.
And that places the emphasis on quality public schools in these rural areas. I agree.
Absolutely.
Well, in the last couple of minutes we have left, Chris, how do you envision the future of the rural economy, say, over the next decade, if you looked into your crystal ball?
Yeah, I think it's going to continue to have some of the struggles that it's had for years, but you're beginning to see a number of communities showing a way out of some of those challenges. So I think it's a matter of rural communities paying a lot of attention to what their sister communities are doing and saying, look, if they can do it, we can do it. If they can build up a responsible, I mean, it's copying is the highest form of flattery. And as I see rural communities paying a lot of attention to what their peers are doing, and I speak to a lot of conferences that deal with the rural areas, and the networking is intense. I mean, people are like, what are you doing? How is it working? How do I do that? And so I'm fairly optimistic, given that the new generation is more oriented towards what a rural community can offer than previous generations, just taking advantage of it.
All right, our guest today is Chris Kuehl. What a great conversation. And Chris, why don't you tell our listeners about your publications, and if they want to get on your mailing list or subscribe, how do they go about that?
Sure. We do a publication that comes out every week. It's called The Flagship, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And it contains this massive chart-loaded thing called The Watch. The best way to get in touch with me is just to send me an email, and I will respond if you have questions, and those too. And the email is simple. It's chris.kuehl, so it's CHRIS.KUEHL at armadaci.com. So that's ARMADACI.com. And that I will send you any information you request. And with a last name like that, you now know why I like German beer. So.
Well, we get the publication here at Southwest Tennessee Development District. It's a great read, great information, and I encourage you to follow up with Chris. Chris, thanks so much for being with us, and we wish you nothing but the best.
Right. Thank you, sir. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on Rural Strong. If you found this helpful, share it and follow the show for more insights from rural leaders making a real difference. Until next time, stay rural strong.